in-depth look at the news and information shaping our community. This is Moose Talks with your host, Doug Craig, on Moose FM.
Welcome to Moose Talks on this Friday. There we go. Friday, April 17th. I'm Doug Craig, as the intro said. Coming up in a bit, we're going to talk to Jessica Coleman with the Fort St. John Literacy Society about what they do there and the Imagination Library program. They need some funding for it, but we're going to talk about what it is and why they need some more funding in just a bit. To start, though, we're going to be talking with Stephen Petrucci, the Superintendent of School District 60, Peace River North, who joins me now. Good morning, Stephen. How are you?
Terrific, Dub. Thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And thank you for taking some time to talk to us today. So, of course, things are very different at School District 60 than they were even a month and a half ago, as now all the delivery is kind of distant for students and staff and parents because of all the social distancing measures put in place because of COVID-19. Why don't we start with this? How prepared was the district and the BC education system in general, if you could speak to that, for a transition like this to distance learning for everybody?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dub. Everyone's kind of in the same boat across the province, and that transition, by the way, continues as information changes every day, both medically and in terms of the expectations from the education sector. But as soon as this sort of came to us near the beginning of March and heading just before spring break, we spent those 2 weeks of spring break as a senior staff and with operations basically coming up with a number of plans. And those, sort of in order of priority, were our pandemic plan in terms of our safety and how to deal with some of our facilities and cleaning and that sort of thing, as well as a continuity of operations plan and the continuity of learning plan. And so that sort of set the stage for us in mid-March to be able to then work with the rest of our staff and our schools to implement, some continuity of learning. Right from the beginning, though, the priority was to ensure that our facilities were safe, that there was a cleaning regimen in place. And then we moved ahead with plans for trying to support our healthcare workers and emergency responders with some supervision of children. And that's been going on this week as well.
I mean, was there any sort of plan in place from before where you'd even considered what things would look like if, say, a pandemic like this had happened? Or was this something you guys kind of had to come up with basically from the ground up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that the entire globe was taken by surprise. And we're no expert. We're not the experts in the medical field and in the science field, and so those people continue to advise us on a daily basis as to how to appropriately respond that way. But what I will say is that School District 60 always had an excellent infrastructure in place in terms of our technology and the creative ways with which our teachers and our support staff were working with students and families already. For example, every student in the district has a Learn 60 Gmail account, which gives them access to sort of the Google tools. And in many ways, particularly at the middle and secondary level, but also even in our grade 6 program, they were accessing technology and submitting assignments electronically, doing all kinds of different things. So in that regard, we were well prepared in some areas to move forward with some kind of continuity of learning.
I see. Now, you'd mentioned this already. The transition's kind of an ongoing process still, but we're about, I'd say, a month into it or so. Can you speak to how it's been so far for the district? What have you heard from staff, students, and parents about the transition?
Yeah, good question. I mean, first of all, I should have started with a big shout out to our staff, and that's from everyone, from operations to administrators to teachers, support staff, custodial, bus drivers, EAs. I don't want to leave anyone out, but everyone really has stepped up. And so the response has been overwhelming. And we continue to get examples of some really creative ways in which our schools are connecting with families at this time. Obviously, everyone's in a bit of a different place, and some fear and anxiety is out there, I think, in every organization, including ours. But in terms of this transition and ongoing information, we stay in daily and weekly contact with the public health office and continue to get advised that way and act accordingly. So that transition continues, and we're now sort of, I think we've set up fairly well some of our remote learning ideas and connections with families. And by the way, in some of our rural locations, we've had some low-tech solutions, including delivering supplies, and connecting with the families that way as far as resources and activities. And then you may have heard, of course, that our schools are also continuing to provide some of those supports for our vulnerable students and families that we did when they were in session in terms of some food and some other support. And we're going to be ramping that up a bit more in the next couple of weeks.
Now, I'm kind of throwing this at you without any preparation, so you may not be able to answer. But beforehand, you obviously had students who were doing some distance learning by correspondence. Do you know roughly what percentage of students were already kind of doing that before the pandemic hit?
Yeah, you're definitely testing me there. But what I will say is that we had many students taking some courses by what you call correspondence. It's kind of more of a blended learning model now in our school
Mm-hmm.
district, but they may take, for example, one or two courses through distance ed and take the rest of their course load on site in their school. So some of that was definitely happening. We do have a smaller core of students for a variety of reasons, their location, their personal interests and choices, who do their full programming through our key learning center.
Mm-hmm.
And that's located, as you know, just beside Burbo's there. And so that those programs continue sort of without interruption. And in fact, the staff there, Norbert and Sean and their teachers there, they've sort of helped us a bit as well with this transition and with some ideas of how to support teachers, support staff in that technology and in connecting with families. And by the way, we've set up a recording studio at the Key Learning Center, and we've started some book readings there with sort of a green screen in the background where the kids can listen to a live storytelling each morning at 10 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll be recording all kinds of other things as well. So that's been kind of cool.
Yeah, no, we've been showing those on our Energeticcity.ca Facebook page if you want to ever check it out, by the way.
Right.
I wanted to touch on this just because was it a matter of when the pandemic hit and you were like, okay, what are we going to do? And those discussions were happening. Was it a matter of taking some of the things or all of the things you were already doing with those students who were already, for one reason or another, required to learn from home most of the time or all the time, and just rolling it out on a mass scale? Or were there other considerations you had to make because of just the nature of suddenly it's not a small percentage of the student population in School District 60, but all of them that are going to be learning that way?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. To be clear, it's not business as usual at
Mm-hmm.
all. And so from the beginning, while we have good infrastructure in place and many of these connections were already happening, the reality is that both the expectations of the school system and, quite frankly, from the families and parents is that we really need to be in tune with what is possible to be done through a remote learning environment. In other words, really just focusing on those main areas, some literacy, some numeracy, the main learning outcomes perhaps at secondary level. And there is absolutely no expectation nor desire to think that we're going to be delivering all of the regular course material that was done in the past. It's really more about keeping the connection going and focusing in on the most important and big ideas that they were working with.
Okay. What are some of the challenges you've faced so far in the process of delivery? I mean, you've talked about rural students, about internet being kind of an issue because not everyone has it, and it's a little more of an iffy connection in some rural areas, especially given that sort of the sort of overarching idea for how this would be done came from the BC Education Ministry, which was maybe only responding to the vast majority of student needs that are all in, say, the Lower Mainland, where it's a city, where these sort of things are a lot more reasonably accessed. Has there been lots of challenges kind of making that fit in a school district like School District 60 that has so many rural students?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to, while we certainly have some pockets where they don't have the same access perhaps for internet, but I think you'd be surprised at sort of the saturation of both internet access as well as technology devices. And again, our district in many regards is, ahead of several southern districts or metro districts in that way. And where we do have challenges, we've come up with some low tech solutions. Our bus drivers are helping out in terms of delivering some supplies and really connecting with the parents in different ways. I'm not saying it's not a challenge, but again, we had some good infrastructure that helped. In terms of other challenges, I think like anyone, it's getting through some of the stress and anxiety related to the pandemic itself. We're in essential services. We're trying to provide as good a service as we can, but also understanding that many of our employees face individual situations. They're supporting families at home. They may themselves be dealing with some medical situations that don't lend itself to going outside of the home. So some of those logistical challenges are probably more prominent than the technology problems.
Speaking of logistical challenges, and as you say, staff having their own kind of individual situations and challenges they have to deal with, how much of a problem or concern do you have with consistency among classes, among grades, among schools, even in how they're delivering the education through this way? Has that been an ongoing issue, or something you're kind of really concerned about, or have you heard any kind of feedback on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question. I think we're still in the early stages, Dub, in terms of connecting and really rolling out what we'll call programming, I guess. There's some basic guidelines, but I'll just reiterate that it's not business as usual. We're not expecting 5 hours of instruction. I think initially, there was a lot of creativity and a lot of enthusiasm, and I think there were probably a few families were, facing a lot of Zoom calls in the first few days there, and we're sort of trying to better coordinate that, work with families with what's reasonable.
Hmm.
But overall, it's really just about maintaining that contact, and we don't have a specific number of hours or criteria. And I guess if there's any expectation, it's to let the public know that it will be inconsistent. But what will be sort of consistent across the system is the contact with their teacher, the contact with the school, and the ability to continue on those most important areas as possible.
And given that people are now at home and they're with their parents, I mean, home can be a distracting place for a lot of students. Have you had any issues with participation? Has it been harder to get students and parents to buy into their child's education now that everyone's at home? They're sharing one space for school, for work, for kind of family activities when, emotionally, spiritually, physically, mentally, however you want to put it, they're used to these being compartmentalized in different places, kind of even in their community. Has that been a problem?
Well, I'm not sure. It's definitely a challenge. It's different. This is a new reality, and quite frankly, Dub, I'm not really sure. I don't think anything will be completely the same.
Hmm.
Further on, in fact. So we're adjusting as we go. It's probably too early to tell in terms of specific situations. What I can say is that our connection with families and students has virtually been 100% in the first 2 weeks here. But obviously, some of those concerns will emerge in terms of the ability for students and families to continue to manage, and we need to be in tune with that and adjust to what the reality is at home as well.
As you say, I mean, it's still very early in the process. What have you in the district learned in case that something like this ever happens? There's talk there might be a second wave in the fall of this, God forbid, but we might be having to resort to these sort of situations again. As a school district, and you had time really to reflect on what's happened so far and maybe how it could be done better in the future, or is it kind of too early for that? Are you still just kind of day to day, kind of getting by with it?
Well, I think it's fair to say we're still in it
Hmm.
and adjusting to these early stages. However, we are mindful of some future planning because we know that this is not going to simply be a matter of a few weeks. And while we can certainly hope to return to some kind of normalcy and regular attendance in the near future, we know that that could be different. There could be other waves. There could be sort of staggered types of models that come out when it comes to attendance and schooling. So it's really too early to speculate on that. But I guess we're definitely all learning about proper personal hygiene practices and washing of hands. And I think all that needs to carry forward. We'll also try and, take the kernels of creativity and connection that have been happening right from day one here and see what we can continue in a variety of ways into the future, regardless of what happens.
Absolutely. All right, Stephen, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for making time to talk to us today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for connecting.
All right. Again, that's Stephen Petrucci, the Superintendent of School District 60. We'll be right back on Moose Talks to talk with Jessica Coleman right after this.
At FSG Return It, we're practicing social distancing, so we've adjusted our hours to help keep our staff and you safe during this pandemic. We're open Monday